To the threat of Islamic State in the Middle East, Turkey has begun bombing IS targets in both Syria and Iraq. The move comes after the Turkish government agreed to let the US military launch airstrikes from their air bases. Both countries have agreed to work together to push Islamic State out of northern Syria. But how realistic is that goal? Martin Chulov is the Middle East correspondent for The Guardian and the winner of the 2015 Orwell Journalism Prize for his coverage of the Middle East. He's in Australia to do a series of talks on the threat of Islamic State and radicalisation. Martin, welcome to The Drum and welcome back home.
Great to be with you, Steve.
Now, before we talk about the latest on Islamic State and Turkey, I want to take you back to an article you wrote last year where you interviewed a senior commander from Islamic State and you got an inside story on the formation of Islamic State and how it started in a US-run jail in Iraq. Tell us about that story.
Well, the US-run prison was Camp Bukka, deep in the southern deserts of Iraq. It was started after the Abu Ghraib scandal. It was meant to be a clean start for the Americans. It was a clean, fresh base with no abuse. But it was a detention centre, and large numbers of Iraqis from all around the country were swept up, and they were put there, and they were filtered. Among them were brothers, sons, cousins who weren't good for anything other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But there were also a core group of hardened ideologues who used that time in prison to organise, to mobilise and to plan for what they'd do when they got out. And my guy, Abu Ahmed, was one of them.
OK, so if that prison had existed, would they have got together anyway, or was this a key factor in the formation of Islamic State?
It was an organising principle. As it was explained to me, they could not have got together so consistently and so easily in so many numbers as they did under the roofs of their US jailers. They sat and they plotted, they organised, they divvied up roles, they decided what would be attacked when they eventually got out, and they did so without any risk of being intercepted by their phones being intercepted or being picked up on the streets.
And the Islamic State leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was there. But how was he I'm interested in this part. How was he able to morph into the self-styled and self-anointed caliph of the Islamic world from what was basically a low-security, quite quiet prisoner?
Well, he used that time that he had in Camp Bukka, which was February 2004 through to December from memory, to be almost the arbiter of camp disputes. He drew legitimacy from the fact that he studied at an Islamic university, and he also had a family lineage which went back to the Prophet Muhammad. So he was respected in prison for those two things that he brought. But Abu Ahmed and some other people that I've spoken to that were there with him said that he was not an especially charismatic figure, but what he did do was convince the Americans that he could actually be a soothing influence, that he could keep this prison calm, and he was released after 9 months.
Now, journalists who try and cover this story often get captured, sometimes tragically are beheaded. Why did Abu Ahmed speak to you?
So I'd met him early in 2012, and it should be remembered that there wasn't an Islamic State as we know it now at that point. There were earlier incarnations of it, but for the purposes of this discussion, ISIS started effectively in its latest incarnation about March 2013. Now, later that year, the guy I'd met, Abu Ahmed, and I'd sat with socially, he was fighting with the regular opposition, but he was summoned to Raqqa, which is the capital of the self-declared caliphate, to meet up with people who he was in Bukka with. And sitting in the room was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who obviously knew him from the old days, and asked him to take a very senior role within the organisation. Abu Ahmed didn't want to do it, but couldn't say no to him. So when he could, he reached out to me, and we had a series of conversations that continue to this day. I last saw him about a month ago, and he's outlined his reasons for being disaffected, and we've had some thoroughly illuminating conversations about how the Islamic State formed, as we've discussed, and also what's been happening since.
Are there many people internally who are disaffected with the way they've moved, and are there people externally who don't want to join because they're looking at the brutality of Islamic State and the direction that they've headed in and say, no, we don't want to be a part of this?
Certainly internally, there are a lot of disaffected people, say at the, I guess, mid-ranking levels. Within the Shura Council and the Military Council, these are the two organising bodies, they are more or less battle-hardened ideologues, and most of them did go through Bukka. They're the real deal. At lower levels, there are Australians, there are Brits, there are others who have travelled to join this caliphate and were seduced by this romantic lure of a dignity lost being reclaimed. They've seen the reality. They've seen that this is a ruthless juggernaut, unchecked brutality that imposes fear and terror on populations for political ends, not so much ideological ends. They're the ones who want to get out, but they're as terrified as Abu Ahmed is.
Sophie?
Martin, what are the implications of Turkey finally willing to enter the fray to address IS?
It's a fascinating dynamic, and I think that it's been driven more by Turkey's worry that the Kurds, who they believe pose an existential threat to their own borders, are gaining strength in northern Syria as they fight ISIS. Turkey have openly said that they believe that the Kurds are a bigger threat to them than this terrorist juggernaut that the rest of the world fears so much. So I think that the Turks are having an each-way bet here, but I think the real quarry for them would be the Kurds, whereas for America, their main ally globally, they expect the Turks to go after ISIS instead. It's going to be interesting to see what happens.
And what about Western officials' suspicions of a sort of undeclared alliance or connection between IS and Turkey in the form of the flow of oil across the border?
Well, that's undeniable. There has been a lot of oil smuggling across into Turkey. Revenues were upwards of $1 to $2 million a day to ISIS from the Turks. At times, the Syrian regime were also buying oil off ISIS. But beyond the oil, though, the Turkish border, which is 900 kilometres, has been the main gateway for foreign jihadists to get into to join ISIS. And I've made 13 trips into Syria, all of them from Turkey. And on every single flight I got from Istanbul to southern Turkey, there were at least 5 to 6 jihadists, not hiding, in full-blown jihadi kit, jihadi ringtones, and they were going to cross the border into Syria. And now Turkey is a very effective police state when it wants to be. It didn't want to be then.
And how much do we know about the nuts and bolts of ISIS? You talk about the two councils. So, I mean, who pays the bills? Who organises the show? We see the very sophisticated social media. I mean, is there a group of ISIS versions of Silicon Valley nerds doing all of this? How does it work? Can we know?
Their IT unit is very sophisticated, very, very capable. Their security keeps bouncing back when foreign governments try to find out where they are. They get bounce backs to Tel Aviv, things like that. So they're very capable. They can defeat the best of GCHQ and the NSA in terms of their communications. In terms of their revenues, they're basically a self-starting entity. They're self-generating as well. Their raid into Mosul last year, which really put them on the map globally, netted them at least $500 million in cash from Mosul banks that were abandoned, and at least $1.5 billion in US-supplied strategic military weapons, which they've used to great effect ever since.
Yeah, these people that are working because one of the fears in this country is that young people are being radicalised via social media. Who are these people who are sitting in these rooms somewhere, orchestrating these videos that we see that are having such an impact? Are they people who've come from the West to join ISIS? Are they university educated? Do we know?
Yeah. There's a lot of work being done on that, and it shows how sophisticated and capable they are that even European governments haven't fully pinned that down. They do believe that perhaps several dozen IT graduates, very capable IT graduates from Europe, form the basis of the social media that you say, this high-definition horror, which is working so effectively. They're in Raqqa and they're in Mosul, and they're very good at what they do.
What is the longevity, do you think, of Islamic State? I remember listening to an interview with a German journalist who got in and monitored them for quite a long time, and he came out of it and said that they were far more sophisticated than anyone realised. Does that mean they're there for good?
They're going to take a lot of defeating. See, their real menace is not that they're able to suddenly attract people as rusted-on ideologues. What they've done is they've positioned themselves as a political alternative for the Sunnis of Iraq and Syria, who have been failed by the political process in both countries, especially since the US invasion of Iraq, which really did change the regional order. It stripped power from the Sunnis, who were Saddam Hussein's sect. In came the majority Shias. They were quickly supported by Iran. ISIS uses that as a dominant part of its message, that we are going to reclaim lost dignity for you guys, and we are a political vehicle to re-enfranchise you, to re-empower you after a decade of losses.
And what about the US-led airstrikes? Are they doing anything to curb Islamic State?
They've killed around 18 of 43 senior leaders, so the intelligence is quite precise, it is quite good. And they've also been able to push ISIS back from Erbil, which is in northern Iraq, and so there are parts of the north of the country, the Kurdish north, that are not as threatened as they were. But in terms of the essential swathe of Iraq and Syria that ISIS seized last year over many months, that remains pretty much within its control. And I think the consensus is amongst some European states that if they can't defeat them in terms of providing alternative messages, alternative political vehicles, there may well need to be some enhanced military intervention.
And do they still have that revenue source to pay jihadists? Do they still have the money left over from the Mosul banks? Do they still have access to the oil fields?
The oil fields have been heavily targeted by the US jets and their allies. They have some cash left over from Mosul, but what they've done is set up a system of governance in the area that they control, and they are levying taxes against businessmen and other merchants, so they do have revenues coming in.
Now, Tony Abbott has previously said that IS is coming after us. Is that true? How much of a threat are they to Australia?
I think the threat to Australia remains a long way over the horizon at this point. ISIS would like there to be a threat in this country, as it would in Europe and elsewhere. And you know, there is some messaging to that effect, but it's not organised. The real threat at the moment is to the regional order in the Middle East. And if that collapses, then that's a threat to the global order, and we would see a self-fulfilling prophecy eventually.
Presumably, though, there is a threat from people operating in their name rather than being connected to them.
Right, and we've seen that here several times in Australia, and that self-starting individual who attaches themselves to the cause is certainly something that needs to be looked at. But I don't think it's an organised systemic threat yet, and I don't think it will be for a while.
You talk about increased military intervention. You know, is there any level of military intervention that could eliminate them? It's
difficult. It would need to be, I hate to use this term, but it's appropriate, boots on the ground. The Americans aren't up for it. They don't want to do it. There is a broad understanding within policymakers in Washington that Iraq was a god-awful mess and remains so, and that they don't want to be drawn back. They do want to use proxies. The Kurds of northern Iraq, the Peshmerga, are a group that they're up for using, but the Peshmerga won't do this unless there's something in it for them. Their cause, obviously, is sovereignty of their own.